All right, I think we can go ahead and get started, and a few more folks will probably trickle in as time goes. I will begin with an introduction for the Power Nature Coalition, and then I'll introduce today's speaker, Melodie Meyer. Um, Thank you everyone for being here today. A quick introduction of the Power Nature Coalition is we are a coalition of just over 250 different groups, environmental nonprofits, land trusts, tribal organizations, and tribal members all coming together to work towards the state goal of protecting 30% of land and coastal waters by the year 2030. We have several different working groups for different topics such as freshwater, public lands, governmental relations, and different regional groups as well. To join Power Nature, you can follow the little link in the chat and fill out a quick Google form and get yourself situated with the groups you want to join. I'm pleased to also introduce Melodie Meyer, EPIC's conservation attorney. Melodie focuses on forest and wildlife conservation at her job at EPIC. She is also passionate about implementing a holistic vision of conservation that uplifts climate justice, tribal sovereignty, and social justice. We're so happy to have you here today, Melodie. And I'll let you take it away with your presentation on getting Jackson demonstration forest to 30 by 30.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here with everyone. Good to see faces, both familiar and new. So today I'll be talking about Jackson Demonstration State Forest. It's the largest demonstration state forest in California. And if you don't know what a demonstration state forest is, that's okay because I'll go over that a little bit in my presentation. So a little bit more background about EPIC. It was founded in 1977 to stop aerial herbicide spraying. We started expanding into different environmental protections across the North Coast. And we do a lot of public outreach and advocacy, but we also work on strategic litigation, um, reframing policies across California, and we've started working in state forest legislation as well in the past few years as the Jackson Demonstration State Forest campaign has unfolded. And you can learn more about EPIC at wildcalifornia.org. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and our redwood forests first to kind of set up the issue and the issue around state forests and how they're currently managed in California. So, with the changing climate, we've seen numerous studies showing that our forests aren't keeping up with the rate of growth because the climate change is causing so many stressors to these forests and their ability to grow. Um, the main contribution to this is the lack of summer fog, and it's becoming just much more dry, much more hot, not as much moisture for these trees to grow. And so, unfortunately, as we've all seen, we're not making the steps needed to lower global warming. And we're really seeing that impact the way that our forests are responding to this. So this is some data compiled by JP O'Brien, actually. So I hope I don't completely butcher the way that this data has been compiled or the inferences that we're drawing from it. But this is a chart showing the rate of growth in JDSF forests specifically. And it shows that redwood forest growth is declining. And the data was collected using four independent methods. The first is tree coring, fixed plot measurements, and the second one, carbon flux towers, and then satellites. So all of these together are showing that around the year 2000, the rate of forest growth starts to decline slowly but steadily. And so it's not just JDSF forest. We also see this happening in Sokol, which is another demonstration state forest. And we see this for global data as well across all vegetation classes. Forest growth is on average declining. And this is, again, primarily due to climate change and the heating around the globe. So, aside from this loss of a carbon sink and carbon storage and sequestration in our forests, climate change is also posing significant risks to biodiversity as well. So, as we know, biodiversity is really important and is um, been really critical for endangered species in old growth forests. Even age clear cuts, which have been historically uh, practiced across California following colonization, have replaced old forests with less complex forest habitat. And so the result of that is species like marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl that depend on old growth habitat are really in a state of rapid decline right now. Even forest management methods that are not specifically clear cut, so things like variable retention or group selection that leave a patchwork of what we call mini clear cuts across the forest, still have impacts to site-specific, microclimates, and just altogether contribute to a less complex forest habitat. Um, and so in JDSF specifically, this has resulted in around only around 5% of old growth remaining. And uh, so we have seen some projects at JDSF that are aimed at doing more restoration forestry, but unfortunately, as we'll see, it's not been enough to fully recover the forest to how it was pre-industrial logging. So this is just a visual of what group selection and why we refer to it as mini clear cuts, because it's taking groups of trees and creating a really stark, harsh line between trees and sort of creating these gaps that are not consistent with how a natural forest is meant to grow. So this is what management currently looks like at JDSF. These are what is called the forest allocations. And as we can see, most of it is what is called matrix. So 55%. Matrix allows even aged harvest. It allows clear cuts in limited amounts. And so everything in the light green is matrix for the forest. 12% is older forest development areas. And so this is sort of a misnomer as well, because it's not managing for older forest or old growth forest. It's managing for all size classes and is just a less intensive version of the matrix, allowing even age. So this is where you'll see more group selection type harvest occur. 22% is late seral development areas. So this is where CAL FIRE is explicitly managing to try and promote more old growth characteristics, doing more things like selection harvesting, less intensive logging. And then only 14%, 14 or 16% is old growth or really protected areas. And so this is where there's no industrial type logging allowed, only limited selection harvesting, and you'll see things like prescribed fire being applied there occasionally as well, but not nearly enough. And so the management for Jackson Demonstration State Forest is option A. So this is a management plan that's required under the forest practice rules for working forests. And under this option A document, they are supposed to achieve the maximum sustained production. How much logging can you sustain over a long period of time? And for this, they project around 20 to 25 million board feet per year. So this is around the equivalent of 6,000 logging trucks per year or 20 logging trucks per day. And so this is a view of canopy height model, a map of canopy height across the forest. So as you can see in the eastern part of the forest, it's not recovering very well from those early years of clear cuts being applied to the forest, industrial logging occurring. And there's very few patches of large trees remaining. And even where there's large trees remaining, if we compare this with the forest management allocation, it's still in this area that allows for even age management. So there's not any protections being applied for these large trees. They're still all open to be harvested under the management plan. And so this EPIC has been sort of monitoring the management plan process, and we've seen that CAL FIRE is still having these same management allocations, the same restrictions and allowances for harvesting in its new management plan. So unfortunately, there hasn't been any substantial changes from the old management plan to the new one. So how do we start to think about what is the issue there? What does CAL FIRE need to be able to make these substantial changes that we're asking for? Because of, as I've referenced before, CAL FIRE is doing some amount of restoration forestry projects, but unfortunately, it hasn't been enough. We're still seeing projects that leave these impacts, like these that we see on the screen, group selection or clear cuts, leaving really dense, not fire resilient patches of forest, and harvesting and marking these large trees for cut. Other concerns that we have with the current management is that their THPs that they're submitting, timber harvest plans, do not go beyond the current forest practice rules to protect the forest. So they're seeking a lot of exemptions. The forest practice rules has, certain limitations on the acreage of clear cut that you can have. They don't allow you to go too close to a water course to prevent things like sediment runoff or heating around a water course. But we're still seeing CAL FIRE submitting plans that are saying, we don't need to follow this restrictions that you have in the forest practice rules. And so they're seeking a lot of exemptions in their plans. Again, clear cuts are still authorized on certain parts of the forest. Herbicides are still used, and we're seeing surveys not being done for rare plants before a timber harvest plan is drafted or approved. And again, there's still really large trees that are being marked for harvest and timber harvest plans that aren't being planned out very well in terms of impacts to water and impacts uh, to wildlife. So let's go into what a demonstration state forest is under current law. So we find ourselves in the Public Resources Code, sections 4631 to 4656. And so a demonstration state forest, this part of the California Code was enacted in the 40s. So when we're thinking about what they wanted to demonstrate, it was demonstrating commercial harvest to private timber companies. And there wasn't any consideration given to biodiversity, to climate change, or to things like indigenous stewardship. It declares that forest land should be made fully productive and that cutover land should be reforested to address the waning supplies of original old growth timber. They also state that the existing land base should be for timber production, for research and demonstration. And again, it sets up CAL FIRE's management duties and requires CAL FIRE to achieve that maximum sustained production. And so this is still the current law that we're dealing with for state forests. And when we look at it in through this lens, we kind of see why CAL FIRE feels like they're stuck in this specific management type where we see they are still prioritizing industrial forest logging. And so this is just a map of of the different demonstration state forests throughout the state. And as we can see, Jackson is by far the largest one. So when we're thinking about how can we update this particular legislation for state forest, what are the concepts that we want to think of? I'm sure all of us have different ways that we think about restoration and what restoration means for a forest. But just through EPIC's work and through our partnerships that we have, both with tribal nations and communities, these are the sorts of things that we have heard are important for restoration. So, managing for safe self-sustainability, no longer managing for commercial purposes, but with the goal of less human disturbances, right? So there's always going to be human disturbance to some extent, but just requiring less human intervention and allowing those natural processes to take over. Managing with tribal stewardship, so allowing tribal nations and indigenous communities to lead that process, incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, and managing at an equal co-governance level. So both the state and tribes having equal say in how the forest is managed. Managing for wildfire resilience, so focusing on thinning. There's lots of parts of the forest that have extremely dense, dry trees closely spaced together. So those really need to be addressed, and unfortunately, they're not under the current management regime. Um, and then finally, managing for long-term carbon storage, because as we know, the larger redwoods disproportionately store more carbon than smaller forests. So now let's kind of take a look at what the specific language is in other parts of the demonstration state forest code and how they can be updated. So the probably most important part of this is the way that management itself is defined. And so management is defined as achieving maximum sustained production. And then after that comes the consideration of values like recreation, wildlife, fisheries. And so we see that ultimately industrial foresting is being given priority here. So what we could do is just sort of flip that and have demonstration forests be demonstrating biodiversity, carbon storage and sequestration, and all of these other values that the community has come to rely on for demonstration states forests like JDSF. And so the term maximum sustained production comes from the Forest Practices Act, but it's really lives in the way that private timberland owners are meant to plan for their sustainability of logging a forest. You don't want to overlog the forest and then end up with a forest that's no longer able to produce timber. And so you have to demonstrate that you can continue to harvest this amount while over a long period of time. But again, we see that the priority there is the profit, the amount of timber that you can harvest, and you're only giving a consideration or sort of an afterthought to these other values because, of course, you would. You're a private timberland owner, and you're not really letting people come onto your lands to recreate all that much. And so we see sort of this stark contrast to a forest like JDSF, where people and tribal nations are using the forest for these other values that are really important. Other sections that are in great need of being updated in the state forest code are um, the reason for the forest in the first place. So again, that was for timber production, demonstrating that. Instead, you could demonstrate things like ecological restoration, um, taking out that language about restoring supplies of old growth timber. Um, as a state, we don't really refer to old growth as a timber product anymore. We refer to it as having a value of carbon storage, for wildlife, for even recreation to some extent. So instead, focusing that on being the reason why the forest is being restored or why these lands are being acquired. Other changes, again, I really want to stress that the maximum sustained production is not compatible with the way that the forest has been used over the past couple of decades. And so um, the having it changed to be more public facing and more focused on ecological restoration and biodiversity would be the main update if we can get this legislation off the ground and running. And so connecting it back to 30 by 30, how would this open the door for 30 by 30? Well, currently, the way that the state demonstration forest legislation is laid out, CAL FIRE can't really do anything about, wanting to bring it into conservation because they have this mandate to demonstrate timber production, which is currently not as compatible when it's for maximum sustained production with the goals of 30 by 30. So by removing this mandate and allowing them to demonstrate other purposes, it would allow for these types of agreements to be formed under 30 by 30 without worrying about bumping into other state law mandates. And a really important other influential way is that restoration forestry could be demonstrated for other landowners who are curious or hoping to be able to do this on their working lands, but also achieve 30 by 30. And so having more of these restoration forestry projects occur on the forest and that being the primary thing that the forest is demonstrating, that would be incredibly helpful to achieving 30 by 30 and allowing others to do this on their forest as well. So how this could work, how could legislation like this be supported? CAL FIRE currently relies on its commercial logging to sustain operations and personnel. That source of funding is very unstable. It varies from year to year whether they're able to harvest that much. The commercial logging in places like Mendocino have seen somewhat of a decline. And so wanting to shift this economy to something like restoration forestry would be supported by the state wanting to see that across different communities. So funding could be provided by the state to pursue 30 by 30 conservation and restoration forestry. And these alternative funding sources would also reduce the incentive to overlog the forest. CAL FIRE would need to take, a number of steps in order to get to 30 by 30. So first of all, changing the legislative mandate for maximum sustained yield logging in state forest. And that would then allow them to change those land allocation percentages that we were looking at earlier in the presentation to reflect restoration forestry for a majority of the forest. Then they could work with restoration forestry leaders to shift their management approaches away from the historic logging regime, and then continue to work with tribal governments, indigenous peoples, and community stakeholders to ensure that adequate protections are made for all of these other values that the forest serves. So updating the State Forest Act not only makes sense because the act itself is so outdated, we're not wanting to demonstrate commercial industrial logging to landowners anymore. It's not a priority. But it's also necessary to get us to where we need to be in terms of meeting the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And JDSF really does have this wonderful opportunity to demonstrate restoration and allow conservation to be the focus, and really meet those community needs that are already the community enjoys the forest so much and wants to see it be sustainable for future generations. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, and we're really excited about this potential legislative effort gaining traction this year. So thank you all so much for attending and for listening.
Thanks so much, Melody. That was an awesome presentation. I feel like I learned a lot about forestry, and I love the marble murrelet on your last slide. It's very cute.
Everyone does.
Feeble little bird. Um, Casey Decker did have a question in the chat about talking about managing for regeneration rather than sustainability, since sustainability can be seen as just really not making conditions worse. That's a good thought. I like that. Managing for regeneration.
Yeah, and I think yeah, so I think it is important to that everyone is on the same page when we're talking about things like sustainability or restoration because it can mean so many different things to different people. And yeah, sustainability, I think, has that sort of industry understanding of, we're going to sustain this level of activity on the forest for a number of years. So it doesn't have as strong of an application when we're talking about we want there to be less logging on the forest. I think that's like our ultimate goal is like less of this industrial logging that leaves these lasting impacts on habitat and on our carbon sequestration efforts. So understanding that it's more about getting the forest back to a place where it can sustain itself and not really needing to not really needing a lot of human intervention. But of course, that's going to take so much work. So a lot of folks are also kind of concerned of like where are all these people who are doing the current logging operations going to go for employment? It's still going to take a lot of work to do that restoration to get it to that place. And so it's a good investment in our environment, but it's also a good investment for folks looking to have a source of employment where you're doing something that, is good for the environment and you can still apply the same skills that you've had in other in prior logging operations.
Right. Mhm. Oh, Sandra, did you have a question?
I do. Thanks, Melody. This was really interesting. I guess my head's already going to like legislation and how we can move this forward. But I think you may have said this already, but is JDSF the only demonstration forest that they're commercial logging in, or are there others that they're in the state?
So it's my understanding that JDSF is the one that is really the source of commercial logging revenue. So there is some operations going on in Sokol. I know in Sokol they have actually more restrictions on the types of logging that they're able to do. So there will be things like selection harvesting, but it's just really not as common to see these big industrial timber harvest plans being applied to these other types of forests.
And I guess my follow-up question is, where are you seeing the most opposition to this?
Yeah, so I talked about it a little bit in my previous response, but there is, quite a bit of opposition from, I would say, private timber um, landowners. And I think that can come from just, a fear of their um, operations being impacted or their ability to harvest their lands being impacted. But I think a lot of that opposition um, can be reduced by explaining the kind of limited effect of this legislation is really to state demonstration forests. So it wouldn't affect a private timberland owner's ability to harvest on their lands. And I think there's a connection to the types of like studies that are done for private timberland owners on state forests where they're like doing studies on, you know, how does a clear cut impact wildfire resilience, or how does a clear cut impact habitat. And so it could be, you know, that timberland owners will have to have studies occur on their forest instead of having it occur at JDSF. But I think that trade-off there is really necessary because a forest like JDSF does have a lot more values that the community relies on and wants to see prioritized. And so um, you know, it could, I think there is a lot of opportunity there to partner with commercial timberland owners on this legislation, because it can benefit them as well to see how restoration forestry projects can still, you know, be good for the economy and sustain a community, what without having these damaging impacts to wildlife or the forest.
Well, that was a wonderfully informative presentation, Mel. Thank you so much. If folks have any other questions, feel free to reach out to either of us. I can put our emails in the chat. Ooh, what about McGuire? Is he on board with taking action? That is a great question. We have been harassing Senator McGuire about this for years, not harassing, politely nudging and reminding him of the issue of the commercial logging on Jackson. Is he on board? I guess we'll see, right?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations with folks in this district in this area, and I think, you know, in the past the campaign has really tried to target the way that CAL FIRE has been working with tribal nations and the way that it does timber harvest plans. And so we've seen some progress occur, and we've had promises from CAL FIRE that their management plan is going to really improve things on the forest. But unfortunately, as we're tracking these things, we've seen there hasn't been these substantial changes. And so I think finally our representatives are starting to see that, is that, you know, these other promises or these like individual timber harvest plans being canceled, or promises of the management plan, they aren't going to fix the overall issue of like this is the way that the state has set up demonstration forests um, for the state, and so we actually need to target that and have that have the umbrella effect on all of these other things that CAL FIRE does. And so I think with that realization, we're starting to see a lot more support from representatives. And we actually did have Assembly Member Rogers and McGuire sign a letter and send it to CAL FIRE saying, you know, you haven't done what you've promised on the management plan. Like, can you tell us what your plan is to address a comprehensive environmental review for this plan, and also, you know, stop proposing timber harvest plans until this new management plan is in place. Unfortunately, CAL FIRE, you know, didn't respond in the way that we wanted. They basically said that, you know, we're the timber harvest plans that we have proposed, put forth, conform to the new management plan, and they conform to some of the policies that were put out by the Jackson Advisory Group. And so we're just going to continue to do that. So hopefully we're seeing more action this year as we're seeing the management plan kind of be finalized, and we'll have a lot of support on this legislative idea.
Thanks, Mel. And someone asked, how fast could this change be to really reduce pressure on the forest? So if legislation were to get passed to end the commercial logging mandate, how fast would that have effect on the forest?
Yeah, so our goal is that every timber harvest plan that would then be proposed for these forests would then have to go and look at the state demonstration forest and see, hey, we're supposed to prioritize these things like biodiversity, wildfire resilience, wildlife, and carbon storage. So we have to conform our timber harvest plan to make sure that those values aren't being negatively impacted and that this timber harvest plan is actually serving the forest and the goals that are set up. So our hope is that it would have an immediate impact in that we wouldn't be seeing the types of timber harvest plans that they're putting forward now, where it's clear that they're just prioritizing the profit and wanting to harvest large trees in order to sustain the forest that way.
Mhm. Oh, and it looks like Casey wants to clarify, what is the time span for making the change? Like if it is past this session, how long before
Yeah.
on the ground?
Um, so I think that it would go into effect if it was passed this year, like within the next year. I'm not sure. Josie, do you remember?
I feel like in the next year would make sense.
Yeah.
Like it would change the mandate in the new year.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously it wouldn't have an effect this year, but in
Yeah.
the next coming year.
Can can I just so you mean 2027? So if some miraculous reason we're able to get this passed this year, then they'd implement it in 2027. So they'd stop doing what they're currently doing. I mean, that's what I was getting at, like
Mhm.
how long it is between fixing the language and actually then fixing the problem on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it would start to be implemented in 2027 unless there was something written into the law that said it will start, effect in 2028 or something like that, which does happen for legislation, but I think our intent is that it would start as soon as possible.
And can I ask one more question about that? So if you were able to mandate this for biodiversity, then it could be counted toward the 30 by 30. That's the whole point of this, right?
Right. Yeah. So currently, when we've asked, how, are you allowed to do 30 by 30 on the forest? They've said no because, we have a mandate to do commercial logging. So a really positive outcome would be that it removes that restriction on them and they would then be able to do these types of agreements that we're seeing, like things like conservation easements on the forest. Yeah.
And we will keep this group apprised as this
Hmm.
develops, when anything is official or when we need folks' support, and stuff like that. We will definitely keep everybody in the loop, as things develop. But thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to educate yourself on this issue and why Epic cares about this so much and why so many people care about Jackson and demonstration forest and for them to be conserved better. Are there any more questions for Mel? All right. Well, this will be recorded, so feel free to access it or ask Mel and I questions. I put our emails in the chat, but thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Melodie, for your time and expertise on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. And please do check out JP and Evan's article if you get the time. It's a really good one.
Yeah, I'm going to send out a link to their article with the recording. It's a great article.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.